go. Okay, okay. Apologies. There we go. Right, welcome everybody. Very nice to see you. This Experts at Work webinar is for members of all three of our networks, as you know. Today we're exploring driving performance management through effective reward. So a big welcome, as I say, to Rameez. Rameez Kaleem is founder and CEO at reward consultancy 3R Strategy, and I'm very grateful to the network members who've recommended 3R. Juan Novoa, who was originally speaking, has had some very sad family news. So we're thinking of him and we're wishing him all the best. Rameez, I really appreciate you stepping in as well. Thank you. Rameez has got some fine provocations for us to think about and some different ways of addressing pay and reward. I think we've got a bit of a... We could ask you to go on mute. Thank you very much. That'd be great. Sorry. Yes, some fine provocations for us to think about, some really different ways of addressing pay and reward, and some relevant ideas about ratings. These things come up a lot and feedback, so I know it's going to be a good webinar today. Do let us have any questions or suggestions in the chat throughout, and I'll keep a note on those, Rameez. And we'll have some Q&A at the end. We're recording this session, as you know. We'll send out the link afterwards along with the slides. Thanks, Rameez. No breakout ones for this 1.5 finish at 3 a.m. late. 3 a.m. 3 p.m. latest. We're not going to go for 12 hours. I think we're good, but we're not that good. Rameez, all yours. I think you've got a question to start with, so thanks again.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, I have a slight cold, so I hope my voice holds, but I certainly will not be talking till 3 a.m. today. But the question I wanted to ask everyone is, before we start, is whether you've been to a restaurant recently and after that experience you decide to leave a review, whether on Google or Trustpilot. Has anyone done that recently? And when can you say when you did that? Was it, I don't know, when you were waiting for the bill, or when you went home, or anyone want to say? Afterwards, next day? Yeah, okay. The reason I asked that is because that's what we always do, right? And that's what reviews are supposed to be. They're supposed to be in the moment. But for some reason, we built our entire performance management process and reviews around reviewing things that happened 6 months ago, 12 months ago, rather than, recognizing people when they do a great job, giving feedback when we feel like something could have been done better. But we wait for a few months or 12 months to speak to people. So today what we want to do is to challenge some of our thinking around performance management, and then see how we can effectively link that to reward. So the first thing that we really need to ask ourselves before we think about reward is 3 questions. The first one is, what does great performance actually mean? Is it about people delivering on their objectives, doing a great job? Is it about people demonstrating the right behaviors that we value and we want to see in our organization? Is it about them developing their skills? Is it about them innovating, collaborating? We're speaking to someone recently who talked about, risk management is really important to them, and that's what they also consider as part of. So we need to be really clear about what does performance actually mean for us. And then we need to be clear about how we recognize all of this. So if it's around objective setting, are we setting those objectives in a clear way so that there's a fair assessment being made? If it's around behaviors, have we defined as an organization what behaviors we want to see, or what high-performing employees typically behave like? So we need to be able to recognize this, because what often happens is there isn't really a clear understanding of what do we mean by performance, or how we recognize this. And this is left to managers, where a lot of them are using their gut feeling on, we feel this person is doing well, let's think back about what this person did over the last 12 months. And then often what happens is giving them a rating at the end of it. And we have calibration sessions. Those ratings can often change, and people we know can have some bias in those sessions as well. So we really need to be clear about those first two elements, and then think about, okay, if we've got our performance management process right, how do we then link this effectively to reward? So in order to do this, and this is where Richard, you were talking about, provocative questions. I don't know if this is provocative, but I think we really need to shift our perspective on performance completely. Because the traditional way of looking at performance is, oh, sorry, I've got a clicker which seems to stop working at times. The first question is, you know, how do we look at performance? And the traditional way where a lot of managers are managing performance is, we know they've been micromanaging, giving people tasks, objectives to do. If they do those tasks, carry out those tasks, we can say they're performing well. But we know increasingly the management style is changing. What employees, and you see this particularly with Gen Z employer, is not to be micromanaged, but to be given autonomy, given accountability for what they're supposed to do, and empower them to do their jobs. So the shift is very much from getting people to perform, but instead creating the right conditions, the strong relationships, and the environment in the workplace where people can excel and do a good job. So what we often say is, you can't say to somebody, you need to perform. So you can't manage performance, but what you can do is create the right culture environment to enable our people to excel in their jobs. So that's a fundamental shift of, it's not the job of the manager to, command and control the team and say what they need to do, but to really get to know them. And, something you might have often heard of when we talk about management or leadership is, management is not about, it shouldn't be seen as a game of checkers, but it's a game of chess. So you don't say this is the management style and you apply that to everyone, but it's about recognizing and understanding the people in your team, what are their strengths and their weaknesses, and you using their strengths and working on their opportunities for improvement, and creating the right culture for them. And if we're able to do those two, then we can recognize that actually we can use reward as a way to enable our people and drive certain behaviors. But if we don't have a good approach, or the right approach to performance management, we can't simply say, well, we need to introduce performance related pay, where we're going to give some people a higher pay increase or a higher bonus compared to other people, and feel like, yes, that's just going to help us shift our culture from to a performance driven culture. But that's the reward element is an enabler, but the enabler only works if we have a strong and effective approach to performance management in the first place. So if we look at redefining performance, we're seeing a shift away from the traditional model where everyone was just being given a set of objectives, and this is what you need to achieve in your role, and they were assessed against those objectives. Now, increasingly, we're seeing organizations either include an element of how in when they're assessing people's performance. And we recently did a survey and we found that around 15 to 20% of organizations actually have a separate rating for a how. So if they have performance ratings in their organization, there's a rating. Sorry, there was a comment around if the slide is blank. Can everyone see my slides?
Yeah, see it.
Yes, so we're just looking at the first step. So yeah, not all of the slide is complete, but yes, we're looking at, we've moved away from just looking at what to the what and how. So Some organizations, around 15 to 20%, we're seeing have a separate rating for the what and the how. But even those that have a single rating or even don't have a rating, they're increasingly thinking about not just what people are delivering, but how they're delivering it. And a great example of this is when you look at sales jobs. We don't want to just drive our salespeople to deliver 1 million revenue, for example, if it means in the process they're not collaborating with their team, sending on leads to them, they're not having good customer service or customer support. But it's not just about what they're delivering, making sure that the how is important for our organization now and also in the future, because the behaviors that they demonstrate are going to help improve account management and future sales for them as well. The other point is around, even if we do consider the what and the how, is that really enough? What can sometimes happen is we have fixed objectives that are assessed. So I've even seen where organizations will say, people should be achieving at least 70% of their objectives in order to be a good performer, or 60% of their objectives. But that then disregards everything else that they might be doing. So if you have someone that has 10 objectives and they missed out on, let's say, 3 or 4 of their objectives, but instead what they did was they came up with new processes, frameworks that increase the productivity of the entire team by 50%. But that's not really something we're considering because we're so focused on what this person has delivered in their objectives. So 30, 40 years ago, we might have seen a lot of organizations set objectives at the start of the year that are valid for 12 months. But now we're seeing organizations changing, shifting very quickly. Objectives are no longer relevant after 6 months, or some of them are no longer relevant. The way we see some organizations address this is saying that their objectives are not set in stone at the start of the year. So you set your objectives, but actually you're able to change or adapt them in discussions with your leaders. In other cases, so for example, we're a small organization, there's 9 of us, but we set our objectives on a quarterly basis because things can change very quickly. And so you're not thinking about, we need to do this for the next 12 months, but let's focus on the next quarter and what we need to do. And then, make sure that you can update them on a regular basis. And so having more regular windows is another way of doing that. Obviously, you need to balance that with, are some people going to say that's too much work, so we want to stick with once a year or twice a year, versus balancing how much change you might see in your organization. And then the third shift you're seeing is a lot of organization and roles don't stick to the descriptions that you have listed, but roles are also changing considerably over time. We've seen how AI, for example, is changing a lot of roles where tasks that they might have been doing themselves manually might be automated through AI. And so now they're more focused on more added value tasks or strategic tasks. So it's a shift away from just thinking about what are the tasks that I need to do, what is my job description, to thinking about what is the overall purpose of this role and how what sort of impact are people having within this role. So the language that I like to use is, instead of performance, is excellence. And again, like I said, I don't really like the term performance management, because feel like it's saying, goes back to the historical way of micromanaging. I need to manage somebody's performance, to instead saying, we're going to create the right environment and culture and relationships to move towards an excellence, or enabling excellence, rather than performance management. So when we think about excellence, it recognizes the full spectrum of how people add value to our organization. So it looks not just at the annual cycle, the last 12 months, but it looks at how people are developing their capability, but not just developing it, but applying that capability in their role. It's about innovation, challenging the way we've done things for the last 10, 20 years and saying, oh, is there a better way for us to do these things? Making sure they're collaborating with their team members and outside of the team. Problem solving, role modeling. So all of these things then become part of excellence. And so it's one of the questions I often ask organizations is to say, think about, most leaders will have an idea of who they think their top performers are. So as an organization, think about who your top performers are and what are they doing or how are they behaving on a regular basis that makes them a top performer. And once you start to gather feedback from people around this, you will get an idea of defining what does excellence look like for you and your organization. Any questions so far, or would you want to do questions at the end? Richard, any preference for you?
We definitely have questions at the end. If anyone would like to come in now, you'll be very welcome. Just raise your hand at the symbol at the top, or wave. Jane, hello.
Hello, Richard. Thank you very much. It was just a thought that came to me as you asked that question, actually, Rameez. And one of the things that's in my mind often with performance management is the notion of the difference between performance, which feels like it's a rather static thing, versus performing or improving. And it's semantics, really, but I think that you're speaking a little bit about language there. I think the language of continuously improving, continuously finding new ways to deliver, continuously developing, that language of continuity in the semantics is, for me, more helpful than talking about a performer or a performance, because it feels like it's a bit static somehow.
Yes, no, I completely agree. I think the language we use is quite important, which is why, I have that preference for excellence. But it's like you said, it's looking at, it's not just static, but it's backward looking. It's looking at what somebody has done over the last 12 months. And particularly when we're linking performance to pay, that makes very little sense if you think about it, because we're thinking about how our salary reflects our ongoing contribution to the organization now and in the future. And what we're doing is we're looking at how somebody has done over the last 12 months to make an adjustment to their ongoing salary and contribution. So yes, that's I think a great way of looking at this is to say, when we think about performance or excellence, it's not just thinking about those 12 months, but it's about all of these things that people are doing. The behaviors, for example, we find tend to be a lot more consistent than 12 months of performance, because your good performer one year is outstanding the next year, and then a new leader comes in and they're under improvement. So that changes all the time. It's thinking about, do they have the skills, capability, the behaviors to consistently contributing to the team and the organization.
Thanks, Jane. It's a good point. And I like your point about performing sounding more active than performance, and equally Rameez's point about excellence taking away from performance management. And notionally, you're right, it is semantics, but in fact, it's very important semantics, just because, as I need hardly tell a group of HR people, it's such a heightened conversation, really, where if it's performance or how people are behaving at work, or performing at work, it's always very personal. So I think the language is important, as you say, Rameez.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about performance, excellence. What does that really mean? And now we need to think about how we capture that. And, there's a discussion that's been going on probably for decades now on whether we use performance ratings or we don't use performance ratings. And there are pros and cons against whether we should or shouldn't. So let's run through some of those pros and cons, and then I can give you my view as well. On what I think, I mean, there usually, whenever you speak to reward people, they'll say, well, there's no right or wrong answer, things for different situations. But I think when it comes to ratings, if we look at the pros and cons, there are some situations where you might say, oh, actually, this is not going to work well. In other situations, it might do. But when we think about this from a HR or reward perspective, we always say that, you know, ratings enable us to make transparent and defensible pay decisions, because we can clearly see through the ratings who is a high performer, who's underperforming, and we can link that back to pay or bonus payments to say, yes, this makes sense, or we should challenge this. So that's one of the advantages. Another is, you know, again, around transparent, links back to transparency a little bit, that we can clearly identify our top performers, and that enables you to have more effective conversations when you're speaking to the leadership team or managers around succession planning, or looking at specific retention strategies for retaining your top performers. So, you know, if you look at your data and you say 10% of our people are top performers, we want to retain them, you immediately have some data to say, okay, let's look at what sort of budget we might need for that 10% of the employee population. It supports you from a legal perspective. So ratings provide evidence for employment decisions, or looking at risks around something like equal pay claims, to say, oh, why is there a pay difference? And you can use those ratings to say, well, this person in this role has been an outstanding performer for the last 2 years, and that's resulted in, and you can show that through the rating and demonstrate why there's a difference, for example, or justifying why some people have been promoted over others by looking at the ratings that they've received. We know a lot of organizations carry out calibration sessions when it comes to looking at performance ratings or performance reviews. And obviously those calibration sessions would be quite difficult if you didn't have those ratings. So managers are comparing ratings across departments, across teams, to see whether they should be making any adjustments or if it all feels fair. And when they're used well, they can create some clarity around expectations. So if we say, this is what meets expectations, or this is what good looks like, it gives or communicates to employees what our expectations are from people, or in terms of what sort of performance that you're looking for. So if we look at that column on its own, it sounds like a very good case of, yes, performance ratings give us a lot of structure, defend us legally, and it's worth implementing them. But on the other hand, there's a lot of research, and I haven't got all the references, but the 3 main references I've used for the research here. One is Harvard Business Review, and the other is Gartner, and the third is Culture Amp. They've all done a lot of research around performance ratings and the pros and cons of that. And some of that research shows that 50% of rating variation comes from the rater and not actually down to the employee performance. And what that is saying is that, you know, almost half of the ratings are accounted for by the bias in the rater. That could be things like the halo effect, where, you know, you having a great first impression and that continues on regardless of what you might see, or the recency bias, where, you know, although you're looking at the last 12 months, somebody's had an amazing November and December, but, you know, they were nowhere to be seen from January to October. But then with the recency bias, they end up getting an outstanding performance rating. So that's, I mean, based on the research, 50% variation is significant. So while we say, you know, the performance ratings provide us with transparent, defensible data, we need to keep in mind that there's a lot of bias according to research in this. And it's not, there's that issue of perception versus reality. So the perception is this all feels fair. We can clearly see how this works, but it could be as a result of bias. And the other thing I would say is also, when you look at the data, you might say this makes sense. And of course it will make sense, because in many ways the rating then drives the outcomes as well. So if we can say, oh, all our high performers are getting high bonuses, well, yes, because that's what the managers are doing. There's a bias in the rating, and then they're thinking, okay, for this rating, I need to give a high bonus as well. There's data around 85% of employees said that in the research said that they would consider quitting after an unfair assessment. So if you think about a lot of employees, when they when they receive their performance rating, they're thinking, well, I don't feel like this is fair. 85%, that's a big chunk of our employees in that group are thinking about quitting. So and only a small percentage of employees, 14%, said that the performance management approach inspires them to do well. So there's a significant damage on employee engagement through the ratings. Reduced collaborations. This often, this is particularly the case when we have forced distribution. And forced distribution meaning, we need to have 5% or 10% of our employees as underperforming, 10% are going to be outstanding, 80% are going to be in the meet expectations or good bucket. With 5 ratings, you have more of a guidance on distribution. I know a lot of organizations now say that they don't use forced distribution, but I think the reality is that when we run calibration sessions, the expectation is that we need to end up along a normal distribution curve. So although it's not enforced, there is, a subtle move towards it. And I think employees also understand this, and it can lead to a culture where people think, well, if my colleague next to me is going to be outstanding, then I've got no chance of being an outstanding employee. I'm going to be underperforming or meeting expectations. So it can impact their motivation around collaborating, supporting colleagues. So they're actually competing with each other rather than collaborating. We know that ratings can also be very time consuming, whether it's, it's running a single calibration session or multiple calibration sessions with managers from across the business. So that takes up a lot of their time. And we also know that in cases where managers don't agree with their performance rating, a lot of the time the conversation that they're having with their employee is to say, well, I wanted to give you this rating, but HR said that I'm only allowed to do this. So it can often lead to a poor conversation as well. And it doesn't, again, help with the engagement of the team. And this is a point that we just discussed around focusing on the past, instead of looking at the future and ongoing contribution. And this is, again, particularly important when we start to link performance ratings to pay. Now, if you're looking at performance ratings purely from a bonus perspective, that makes sense, because the bonus is around rewarding people over the last 12 months. But if it goes beyond performance to look at things like pay or succession planning or promotions, then I think we should be careful about not just looking at the last 12 months to make those important decisions. We did some research in a report in our global salary planning survey recently, where we asked people if they use performance ratings. And you can see 46% said that they use performance ratings and they have a single rating. 15% said that they use 2 ratings. So they have 1 rating for what and 1 rating for how. 11% didn't have a formal performance management process. And 28% said that they have a formal performance management process, but they don't use ratings. So that means they could be having, they could be setting objectives, they could be having regular one-to-ones, conversations, feedback, but they don't have a rating at the end of it. Any comments or questions on that one? I think, is it
Rupert, sorry, yeah.
Rupert, yeah.
Hi, Rameez. Hi there. I'm not sure if you can see me or not. Apologies, my camera doesn't seem to be working. I did a question for you. When companies don't do the ratings, is there any differentiation of reward, or is it sort of like consistent for everybody in that case?
So if they I think it varies from organization. So in some cases, they're using it purely for bonus, but there is differentiation in bonus because, you know, it goes back to the point of ratings. When we say ratings enable transparent, defensible pay differentiation, because you can look at, oh, this person's rated 2, this person's rated 3, but if you don't have those ratings, as long as objectives are being set, people are having one-to-ones, giving feedback, giving recognition, having conversations, then they have a good idea at the end of the year how people have performed and whether they should be given a higher bonus or a lower bonus. Because you could also argue there are organizations that are setting objectives at the start of the year, are not having any one-to-ones or feedback, and it just comes to December where managers could end up saying, oh, let's give out a rating. And so I would argue that those organizations that are having regular conversations, setting meaningful objectives, collaborating, but don't have a rating are in a much better position than those that are just setting objectives once a year, having an outcome at the end of it, which again could be 50% as a result of bias.
What do you think, Rupert?
Yeah, I mean, it's a perennial question, isn't it? We keep going back to it every year. You'd think now after 30 years I'd have a point of view, but still scratching my head a little bit because again, I have that process in place right now, and it just feels that the differentiation is not based on objective data, and therefore, you get back to, I want to remove bias and subjectivity by putting a little bit more control over the performance management process, the objective setting, and the calibration of performance. So you sort of I keep coming full circle on it. Never seem to be happy with what I've got in place, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes back to whether you have ratings or you don't have ratings. The important point is making sure that there's a process that has results in regular conversations, effective objective setting, regular reviews, feedbacks, recognition, because you could argue that if you're not having any of that, then actually is only a perception of objective differentiation. There isn't really objective differentiation because it's just the gut feeling of the manager giving a number or a rating at the end of the year. But because we have that rating or number, it's creating that perception, oh, this is fair. But the bias is all in how those numbers have been allocated. So I think if we think more around the performance management process, that is more important than saying, do we have a rating or we don't have a rating? Because that's the prerequisite. And if you can get that right, then you can, decide based on your culture, the maturity of the manager, because you need more mature managers to be able to give them the discretion to manage their own budgets without guidance around ratings as well.
Thank you. Interesting.
Thanks, Rupert. And Rameez, there's one more question, but I think you might. I just want to check that next slide that you have answers this. Lisa was saying, I'd be very interested to know what percentage of our organisations still use forced distribution.
So we don't have data on this, but I mean, I would say it's very little, because when we speak to most organizations, nobody really says we have forced distribution. But when you dig a bit deeper, inevitably, a lot of them are saying, well, there is an expectation from our CEO that when it comes to the end of calibration, we should be along this normal distribution curve. So there might be a slight deviation of 2-3% from what you might expect along a normal distribution. But so yes, it's not forced, but it's calibrated towards a normal distribution in most cases.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Rameez.
So let's think about how we identify some of our top performers. And this is some of the things we talked about already is, are we having quality conversations? And this is one thing I would really recommend is, whether you have ratings or you don't, is to give training to your managers on how to have quality, meaningful conversations. And this might mean in some cases they have to have difficult conversations because somebody's not performing as they should be. In other cases, it's just giving them guidance on what they should be doing in these conversations. So, that sort of checkers versus chess example earlier, they should be getting to know their people. What are their aspirations, what they want to develop, what they want to do in their career, what are their interests? Because again, there are many factors that impact somebody's performance. It could be the relationship they have with their colleagues, with their manager. It could be, do they have the resources to do their job? It could even be factors outside of work or mental health. And so these conversations are around managers making sure they get to know their people, so that they're well equipped to then support them or enable that excellence. There's a lot of research. A couple of books I would recommend. There's a book by Kim Scott called Radical Candor, around how to have good conversations. There's another book called Crucial Conversations, which is written by 3 or 4 authors. But they really talk about how to have these quality conversations. So, for example, one of the things they talk about, and the biggest predictor of success in these conversations or difficult conversations is creating psychological safety in the first 60 seconds. So it's just showing, a lot of people go to these meetings thinking, worried about what's going to happen, or are they in trouble or whatever. But it's creating that psychological safety in this first 60 seconds so that they're able to share their honest feedback and concerns. Covered that point around managers and the training. I think as part of this, we can all often focus on I always used to have this problem, which was, my focus is always on how we can improve, and realized, aside here, like a lot of people felt that, there wasn't enough recognition. And I think as managers, sometimes you can take that for granted, is we need to recognize our people on a day-to-day basis for a job well done. It doesn't always have to be outstanding, but people demonstrating the right behaviors, something we want to see, but reinforcing them through recognition. And that's a really important part of manager training and conversations when we think about performance management. Not everything, because we're talking about linking performance to reward as well, and not everything that we look at as part of performance management or contribution or achievements need to be linked to bonus or pay, but recognition is a really powerful way of reinforcing performance and achievements. As part of this process, we should also be fair about failure, or what's deemed failure. And like I said, in some organizations, they might say, you have to achieve 70% of your objectives or 60% of your objectives in order to meet this criteria. But there are often factors outside of our control. It could be the business strategy change and the priorities changed, but the objectives weren't updated. It could be somebody in the team had to, unexpectedly have to go away for a few months, and you had to cover for other people and collaborate and support them. So all of these things we should consider as part of this process, because all of this otherwise leads to this perception of unfairness, and why most employees are telling us that they don't trust the performance management process. And then finally, leading back to the same point around, shifting from performance management to enabling excellence, are we creating the right culture, environment, and conditions? Giving support to our line managers, not just looking at, past objectives, but supporting the well-being and environment of our colleagues. And really identifying, some people will shout about their achievements, and they will want public recognition. And you might see introverts, for example, that just keep to themselves, and they might say, I'd prefer if you don't mention my name in the team meeting, but, I really appreciate in the one-to-one having that feedback. So it's, again, that chess analogy, but knowing people and knowing how to create the right conditions for them. So just last couple of slides. Now we've talked a lot about performance and excellence. It's thinking about how do we link this to reward. So it's about concentrating our reward investment. So identifying the specific activities that drive value in our organization. And I think sometimes that can be a danger. Sometimes we look at sales incentives, and we look at sales incentives, and the sales teams have designed them, and they will put in things like, we want this role to make 20 phone calls a day. We want them to spend at least 10 minutes per phone call with each client. And so they're trying to look at all of these things and drive everything to a reward. But ultimately, what they should be looking at, we want our people to build great customer relationships, and we want them to bring in revenue. And so think about those things that really drive value, and looking at those things rather than trying to incentivize everything through reward. Because those things that, about making phone calls and spending time on the phone, they should be the role of the manager to, again, create the right environment to make sure that people are doing those tasks as part of their job. Keeping it simple is another point, and links back to what I was saying previously as well, where, if you look at each individual thing, you end up with 10 metrics that drive your bonus scheme or an incentive scheme. But really try and keep it simple. And I always think, an employee, we should be able to say to an employee that if the outcome is X, then your reward or incentive payment is Y. And we should be able to present this in a simple way like this, rather than you or them having to create a complicated spreadsheet where they can enter in numbers to try and figure out what their incentive is going to be. Obviously, that's not the case with the bonus, because it's a lot more discretionary, but that's where, again, when it comes to setting objectives, it's about looking at, one of the things that we recommend is, instead of having 10, 15 objectives listed, we call it OKRs, objectives and key results. So your objective is overall, I need to, improve our processes, and then you list like 3 targets. So I'm going to process 20 invoices this month. I'm going to reduce the time by 20%. So you have an overall objective and then key results for that objective, and sticking to a small number and focusing in on them rather than trying to do too many things. And then think about your full toolkit of reward. like I said, not everything needs to be linked to pay or bonus. There are some other things that we can look at as well, which includes base pay. So base pay we've talked about. So if you want to link into pay, it's about thinking about meaningful differentiation. And again, I'm sure you've come across organizations in the past as well where, you spend hundreds of hours on performance management processes, doing ratings, calibrations, and at the end of it, one person gets a 3.2% increase, somebody else gets a 2.6% increase. And, all of that work, is there really, is that 0.6% going to help us retain and drive high performance from those people? So think about, if you are going to link it to pay, make it a meaningful differentiation. When it comes to bonus, try and think about how you enable people to share in the company's success or the team's success. So it's not just about what people are delivering individually, and link it back to the overall organizational strategy. Even when it comes to sales incentives now, we're seeing this increasingly. Is in the past, you might have somebody saying, some roles incentivized on you deliver X amount of revenue and you get paid Y. But now it's, you need to work with your team members. And if you achieve X, but your team is also achieving 5X, then this is how you might be incentivized. So try and link it back to the team to promote collaboration. The long-term incentives, if you have any, they're proven for senior leaders. So you might be looking at between 3 to 5 years, whether it's a cash long-term incentives or where it's linked back to equity or shares in some way. But they, again, help you with motivating and retaining key talent. In some organizations, they can also use long-term incentives as part of succession planning. So when you're looking at your high-performing employees, or and with succession planning, some organizations might even start rating people based on potential. So high potential employees who are likely to get promoted or move into higher roles, looking at long-term incentives for those people as well. Recognition is really powerful and really doesn't cost very much, because when you're looking at recognition, we often think about Employee of the Month awards or annual awards or, budgets for managers. But actually 95% of recognition is non-monetary. It's about the everyday thank yous and appreciation for team members for a job well done. And it's about not taking their work for granted, thinking about, it's a very powerful way of, for example, linking employee behavior to your organizational values, to say, these are our values, these are our behaviors. When we see people demonstrate those behaviors, we recognize them, and that reinforces that behavior. And that doesn't have to be just with behaviors. You can recognize, achievements, completing a project, getting a new project, and again, celebrating that as a team. And this is not something we don't often think about, but, I don't know if you do exit interviews, but we know a lot of people leave because they're looking for career progression and they're looking for development. And so another non-financial way of recognizing people is by getting them involved in projects they might not ordinarily get involved in. So maybe an exec team member or CEO is leading on a project, and you get one of your high potential employees onto that project, supporting them, which is great development for them, and in some ways recognition of their work. So development opportunities, stretch assignments is a great way to reward people for their contribution as well. And that's the end of my presentation, but any questions, happy to
Thanks, Rameez.
So,
Thanks so much. Ruth, thank you for coming so quickly.
That's all right. Yeah, thanks very much, Rameez. One of the challenges that I have is that people all want to be exceptional. So if we kind of set it around meeting the expectations of their role or achieving their goals, or I feel like a lot of the dissatisfaction is because they actually want to be better than that. And so that kind of doing everything you're expected to do and being on target, all of those sorts of things is not quite enough. Like I feel like they're always a bit dissatisfied unless they are exceeding or exceptional. And the psychology of that, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
yeah, I mean, do you so this is your organization, you use ratings?
Yes, we do use ratings, yeah.
And do you have definitions of what it means to meet expectations and what it means to exceed expectations?
Yes.
Okay.
And we use multiple data points. So it's a consulting business. So they would get feedback at least monthly on every client engagement that they're on from the people that they're working with. So the aim is that it's not just one data point close to where an assessment is, but you've got a number of different pieces that all rate you on the various capabilities.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things I would say. One is around if you're having monthly one-to-ones with people, managers might be avoiding sometimes having this conversation, because if you're having regular one-to-ones, in the vast majority of cases, when it comes to the end of the year, it shouldn't really come as a surprise to them where they sit for the rating. Because if they're saying, oh, you're doing a very good job and this is what we're supposed to do and you're on target for what you're supposed to do, I think those sort of conversations help to set expectations, because often where employees are unsatisfied is where these conversations are not taking place. It comes to the end of the year, and we know by nature most people feel they're underpaid and they're performing better than they are. And so they will feel, well, I'm exceeding expectations and nobody told me throughout the year. If you had told me, maybe I would have made some changes or improvements. So that's one thing I would say is managers should have those conversations. But I also do think that this is a challenge with ratings, because you when you're using ratings, you probably are looking at some sort of distribution, and you're not going to have even if you have a very high performing team, often only a small percentage of people will be able to go into that outstanding bracket. And so with some people, you will have to have a conversation that, yes, you might have exceeded expectations, but it doesn't meet the standard because these other two people have been significantly above. And that goes to the point where I said you're almost creating that culture of competition. So my personal, if I was setting something up from scratch, nothing was in place, I would say you have fewer challenges without ratings. But if you have ratings in place, what I would encourage is more guidance and training for managers to make sure that in those regular one-to-ones, they create the right expectation so it doesn't come as a surprise at the end.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Ruth?
Yeah, I can see that. I guess there's maybe something in getting people to play back what they've heard as well, isn't there? So you've heard this feedback. Now, how did that land with you? How would you assess yourself? How would you rate yourself? And then maybe it's making sure that they've heard what was intended, and that they don't walk away. Because sometimes you do get it, it's like, doing a great job, here's all these things, and then they tell you the other things that need improving, but all the person hears is you're doing a great job. And they kind of walk away thinking that they're brilliant still. So I think maybe there's something about checking, I guess, the understanding, and it has the message landed as it was intended to. I think maybe that's part of where the disconnect is that we have.
Interesting. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks for the question. I'd like to bring in Jane, if I may, because that sounds like it's what you're saying there is very relevant to what Ruth's just saying, I think, Jane. Some of this is driven by the Dunning-Kruger paradox. What's that? It sounds like a 70s rock group.
Yeah, well, obviously, I was around then. The Dunning-Kruger paradox, and other folks on the call may know better than me, but that one is about people who are less than average performers typically thinking having an inflated opinion of their performance. And also the paradox is that people who are good performers often undermine underestimate where they are. So you've got that sort of upside down picture, first of all, where people can overplay when they shouldn't, and people underplay when they shouldn't. And then this whole illusory superiority is that notion that, if you ask someone, how good is your driving, then 80% of us will say we're better than average. Well, how does that work? How does that work then statistically? How can everybody be better than average? How does that work statistically? So there's also just something human about the fact that we have a bunch of us who just find it hard to accept that we're average. Nobody likes to accept that they're average on any count, really, or on most counts.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, because you find similar data on pay as well. So if you ask people, 80% of them will think they're paid below the average or paid at lower quartile, because they have a sense of we're not paid fairly or enough for our jobs.
Makes sense. Excellent.
Yeah, I wasn't offering it as an answer, sorry. I was just offering it as a further problem, which isn't helpful in this sort of call, I'm sorry.
Insight. It was insight. I'll find a reference, actually, because it's very useful. Thanks, Jane. Rameez, that was great. We're coming up to time. So thanks, everyone, for coming along. Rameez, thank you ever so much for such a thorough presentation and discussion. Very much appreciate it. We'll send the recording out and the slides. Rameez, we'll see you again soon, and we'll see Network members again soon, too. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.